Welcome to the final episode of Faith, Power, and Emancipation podcast series. My name is Dr. January Asongu, and I want to begin by thanking each and every one of you who has followed this journey from the very beginning. Over the past 15 episodes, we have walked together through every chapter of faith, power, and emancipation, liberative realism, and the ethics of truth and freedom. We began as what began as a conversation about liberation theology has become a much broader reflection on truth, power, responsibility, institutions, and ultimately the moral vocation of every human person. Today, we arrive at the conclusion of the book. The title of this concluding chapter is Liberative Realism and the Discipline of Freedom, the God who hears and the responsibility to act. I believe this title captures the entire message of the book. Notice it begins with God and it ends with human responsibility. That order matters. Christian faith has always proclaimed that God hears the cry of the oppressed, from the Israelites in Egypt to the prophets confronting injustice, to the ministry of Jesus among the poor and marginalized. The biblical story consistently reveals a God who refuses to ignore human suffering. This conviction remains one of the greatest contributions of liberation theology. Oppression never has the final word. Human dignity is never forgotten by God. History is never abandoned to injustice. Yet, there is another truth that is equally important. God's concern for justice does not eliminate human responsibility. Quite the opposite. It intensifies it. Through scriptures, God continually works through human beings. Moses is called to confront Pharaoh. The prophets are sent to challenge kings. The apostles are commissioned to proclaim the gospel. The church itself is entrusted with the ministry of reconciliation. Again and again, divine grace calls for human action. This is precisely where liberative realism seeks to make its contribution. Liberation is not something that simply happens to us, it is something for which we become responsible. Throughout this series, we have repeatedly encountered one central theme. Freedom requires discipline, not only political discipline, but moral discipline, intellectual discipline, spiritual discipline, institutional discipline. Without these, freedom eventually destroys itself. Modern culture often defines freedom as the ability to do whatever one desires. Christianity proposes something much richer. Freedom is the capacity to choose the good. Freedom is the ability to act truthfully. Freedom is the courage to assume responsibility. Freedom is not merely liberation from oppression, it is liberation for human flourishing. That distinction changes everything because it reminds us that the purpose of freedom is not simply autonomy, it, its purpose is responsibility. Throughout the book, I have argued that every generation faces new forms of domination. Sometimes they are political, sometimes economic, sometimes theological, sometimes ideological. Sometimes they arise through misinformation and digital manipulation. The forms change, the moral challenge remains remarkably constant. How do we remain faithful to truth? How do we protect human dignity? How do we resist oppression without reproducing it ourselves? How do we build societies capable of sustaining justice across generations? These questions do not admit simple answers, but they do point us towards a particular way of living. Liberative realism is ultimately not just a theory, it is a habit of mind. It is a way of approaching reality. It asks us to be courageous enough to confront injustice, humble enough to recognize the limits of our own knowledge, wise enough to build institutions rather than merely criticize them, disciplined enough to resist hatred even while resisting oppression, hopeful enough to continue working for justice even when progress appears painfully slow. Perhaps that is the deepest lesson I hope readers will carry with them. Human flourishing is never accidental, it must be cultivated. Families cultivate it, churches cultivate it, schools cultivate it, universities cultivate it, communities cultivate it, nations have to cultivate it. Every act of honesty contributes to it. Every institution committed to accountability strengthens it. Every teacher who seeks truth. Every parent who forms character. Every public servant who refuses corruption. Every citizen who chooses integrity over convenience. Each becomes a participant in the work of liberation. Too often we imagine history changing only through great leaders. The truth is much more encouraging. History is also changed by ordinary people who consistently chose truth over falsehood, justice over convenience, responsibility over apathy, hope over cynicism. That is how civilizations endure. That is how freedom survives. That is how faith becomes visible in history. As I conclude this book, let me also offer one final reflection. We live in a fragmented world. Political polarization continues to grow. Technological change accelerates almost daily. Artificial intelligence is reshaping knowledge itself. Global conflict continues. Economic uncertainty remains widespread. It is tempting to become discouraged. It is tempting to conclude that truth no longer matters, that institutions cannot be trusted, that moral responsibility belongs to someone else. I believe Christian faith calls us towards a different conclusion. Not optimism, not naivete, not hope. But hope. Hope grounded in truth. Hope disciplined by realism. Hope expressed through responsibility. That is the hope of liberation, of liberative realism. It is the conviction that with that while no society will ever become perfect, every society can become more truthful, more just, more humane, more responsible, and that every one of us has a role to play in that work. And as we come to the end of this series, I simply want to say thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank you for thinking with me. Thank you for engaging these ideas with seriousness and generosity. My hope is that this series has encouraged you not simply to understand the book, but to reflect more deeply upon your own vocation as a citizen, as a leader, as a scholar, as a believer, and above all, as a human person called to pursue truth and justice. Before we close, I would like to say a brief word about these podcast series themselves. These conversations are designed to make my books more accessible to the wider audience. Not everyone has the time and ability to read an entire academic book immediately. These podcast episodes are intended to serve as companions to the book, introducing the major ideas, explaining the central arguments, and inviting listeners to explore them more deeply. Our first podcast series was based on The Splendor of Truth, my foundational work in philosophy, where I introduced the framework of critical synthetic realism. The second series, this second series has explored faith, power, and emancipation, which develops the theological implications of that philosophical foundation and introduces the concept of liberative realism. Our third series will return to philosophy and will focus on my book entitled Epistemic Fracture and the Faith of Civilizations. That book was just recently published and it will be exciting. I hope you will join me again for that journey. If you have enjoyed this series, please like the videos, subscribe to the channel, share it with others, and leave a comment below. Your support helps these conversations reach people around the world who are searching for thoughtful engagement with philosophy, theology, and the great questions of our time. And if you would like to explore these ideas in their complete form, I invite you to purchase my books. They are available on Amazon or go to asongubooks.com where you can find all my books. I think there are over 30 of these books where you will also find more information about other scholarly active about other scholarly articles and ideas that I'm developing. Until we meet again, may God bless you, guide you always towards truth, strengthen your commitment to justice, deepen your love for wisdom, and grant you the courage to become an instrument of authentic human flourishing. Thank you for listening and see you soon. Bye.